White neighbor called cops on black wedding. Then froze when cops saw the groom was the police chief. Andrea's voice cracked with decades of buried rage as she screamed across Maple Street. You people don't belong here. This is our neighborhood. But when the police officers saluted the groom, her world shattered. Chief Dylan Johnson wasn't going anywhere. Before I dive deep into this story, please subscribe, share, comment where you are watching from. Thank you. The crystal wine glass trembled in Andrea Duke's manicured fingers as she peered through the silk curtains of her pristine living room window. Across Maple Street, the colonial house that had stood empty for months was now alive with an explosion of color, music, and laughter that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. White roses cascaded from every surface of the Johnsons' backyard, their petals catching the golden light of late afternoon like scattered diamonds. Tables draped in ivory linens dotted the perfectly manicured lawn, each one crowned with towering arrangements of peonies and baby's breath. The sweet fragrance of jasmine drifted through her slightly open window, mingling with the rich aroma of barbecued ribs and the melodic strains of jazz music that pulsed through the evening air. Andrea's 47-year-old heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the celebration unfold. Children in their Sunday best chased each other between the tables, their delighted squeals piercing the elegant atmosphere. Elderly couples swayed to the music on a makeshift dance floor, their faces radiant with joy. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, black faces filled with happiness that seemed to mock the growing knot of anxiety in Andrea's stomach. She had built her fortress of wealth and isolation deliberately. Every detail of her Georgian mansion had been curated to create distance. The towering hedges that blocked curious gazes, the electronic gates that filtered unwanted visitors, the climate-controlled silence that insulated her from the messy unpredictability of human emotion. For 23 years, Willowbrook's most exclusive neighborhood had been her sanctuary, a place where nothing unexpected ever happened. Until today. The bride emerged from the house, and Andrea's breath caught in her throat. Emily Rose Johnson was ethereal in ivory silk that seemed to float around her curves like liquid moonlight. Her dark skin glowed against the pristine white of her dress, and when she smiled, God, when she smiled, it was as if the sun itself had decided to take residence in her face. She moved with the grace of a woman who had never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she belonged in spaces of beauty and celebration. Andrea's wine glass slipped, red liquid splashing across her white cashmere sweater like a wound. The stain spread quickly, seeping into the expensive fabric with the same inexorable certainty that the memories were seeping back into her consciousness. Memories she had spent decades burying beneath layers of success, charitable donations that felt hollow, and relationships that never quite reached the tender places in her heart. The groom appeared beside his bride, tall and commanding in his navy dress uniform, and Andrea felt her world tilt slightly off its axis. Dylan Johnson was devastatingly handsome, yes, but it was something else that made her hands shake as she reached for her phone. It was the way he looked at Emily Rose, as if she were the answer to every prayer he'd never dared to speak aloud. It was the protective curve of his arm around her waist, the gentle kiss he pressed to her temple, the absolute certainty in his posture that declared to the world, "This woman is mine, and I am hers, and nothing on earth could convince me to let her go." It was everything Andrea had never had, everything she had convinced herself she didn't want. The music swelled, voices joined in harmony, and the celebration seemed to mock the sterile perfection of her own existence. These people, these intruders, had brought life to a street that had been safely, predictably dead. They had shattered her careful quiet with their bold joy, their unapologetic claim to space in a world that had taught Andrea that happiness was something you earned through suffering, through perfect behavior, through never, ever making waves. Her manicured finger hovered over the number she had programmed years ago but never used. Emergency services. One call would restore order. One call would remind everyone that this was her neighborhood, her sanctuary, and some celebrations simply didn't belong in places like Willowbrook. What do you think drives people to call the police on celebrations that threaten their sense of order? Have you ever found yourself uncomfortable with joy that doesn't include you? As the last notes of the wedding march faded and the crowd erupted in applause, Andrea Duke made the call that would change everything. 911. What's your emergency? Her voice, when it came, was steady and cold as winter steel. I'd like to report suspicious activity. Andrea Duke had not always been a woman who called the police on weddings. Once, she had been the girl who pressed wildflowers between dictionary pages and believed that love could conquer any obstacle. That girl had died on a rain-soaked night at Exeter Academy 29 years ago, buried beneath the weight of a choice that had haunted every success Andrea had achieved since. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone, professional and distant. What type of suspicious activity are you reporting, ma'am? Andrea's throat constricted as she watched Dylan Johnson lift Emily Rose's hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that made something ache deep in Andrea's chest. There's trespassing. Loud music. Disturbing the peace. The words felt like glass in her mouth. This is a quiet neighborhood. We have noise ordinances. Even as she spoke, Andrea knew she was lying. The music wasn't that loud. The celebration was contained to the Johnsons' own property. But the truth, that their joy terrified her because it reminded her of everything she had sacrificed for the illusion of safety, was too dangerous to speak aloud. We'll dispatch a unit, ma'am. Can I get your name? Andrea Duke, 247 Maple Street. Her name felt foreign on her tongue, as if she were betraying someone she used to know. As she hung up, Andrea's reflection caught in the hallway mirror. A woman who had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. Her honey blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the late hour, her designer clothes immaculate except for the wine stain that bloomed across her chest like a scarlet letter. At 47, she was stunning in the way that wealth and careful maintenance could make a woman stunning. But her green eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who had forgotten how to feel genuine emotion. The Duke Steel Empire had been her father's legacy, built on the sweat and sacrifice of 3 generations of men who believed that success was measured in the weight of one's bank account and the fear in one's competitor's eyes. When cancer claimed Thomas Duke 5 years ago, he had left Andrea not just billions of dollars, but also the crushing expectation that she would carry on the family tradition of emotional isolation disguised as strength. Feelings are weakness, Andrea, he had told her during one of their last conversations, his voice papery but still commanding from his hospital bed. The moment you let people see what you need, what you want, what scares you, that's the moment they have power over you. A Duke never gives anyone that kind of power. She had built her entire adult life around that principle. Duke Steel operated with ruthless efficiency under her leadership. She donated millions to charity but never attended the galas. She dated occasionally, always men who understood that their relationship had boundaries, expiration dates, and non-disclosure agreements. She had crafted an existence of perfect control, perfect predictability, and perfect loneliness. But watching the Johnsons' celebration, seeing the way Dylan's entire family seemed to orbit around their joy like planets around the sun, Andrea felt the fault lines in her carefully constructed world beginning to crack. Through her telescope, a piece of equipment she told herself was for stargazing but used mainly for monitoring her neighborhood, she could see individual faces now. Dylan's mother, tears streaming down her cheeks as she adjusted her son's tie. Emily Rose's father, his chest puffed with pride as he prepared to walk his daughter down an aisle made of rose petals and dreams. Children who belonged to various relatives, their faces sticky with cake frosting and bright with the kind of unguarded happiness that Andrea hadn't felt since she was 7 years old. And then there was Keisha. Not actually Keisha, of course. Keisha Williams had been dead for 26 years, killed in a car accident while working double shifts to support her family after Andrea's silence had destroyed her future. But Emily Rose had Keisha's smile, wide and generous and completely unguarded. She had Keisha's laugh, rich and musical and infectious. She had Keisha's way of touching people when she spoke to them, as if physical connection were as natural as breathing. The memory of her former roommate hit Andrea like a physical blow. Keisha, brilliant and determined, who had planned to become a pediatric surgeon. Keisha, who had tutored Andrea through advanced calculus without asking for anything in return. Keisha, who had faced expulsion with quiet dignity, while Andrea clutched the letter that could have saved her, paralyzed by the fear of what speaking the truth might cost. You could help her, Marcus Fairfield had whispered in the dormitory common room, his voice slick with the casual cruelty that came so easily to boys born into power. But then again, why would you? It's not like she's really one of us, is it? Andrea had chosen silence, chosen safety, chosen the approval of people whose opinions ultimately meant nothing over the life of someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. The police sirens in the distance made her stomach lurch with a familiar cocktail of guilt and dread. In moments, squad cars would arrive to investigate her report of suspicious activity. A report she had made not because any laws were being broken, but because the sight of black joy in her carefully segregated world had triggered every defense mechanism she had spent decades perfecting. As the first police car turned onto Maple Street, Andrea Duke realized that she was about to relive the worst moment of her life. Except this time, she was playing the role of the villain. The police cars materialized on Maple Street like metal predators, their red and blue lights painting the evening in harsh, unforgiving colors. Andrea watched from her window as 3 squad cars pulled up to the Johnson house, their presence an obscene intrusion on what had been, moments before, a scene of pure celebration. The music stopped. The laughter died. Children pressed closer to their parents, and elderly guests instinctively moved toward the house. Andrea felt bile rise in her throat as she realized what she had done, what she had become. But it was too late to take it back. The first officer out of the lead car was young, maybe 25, with the eager intensity of someone trying to prove himself. He strode toward the wedding party with his hand resting casually on his utility belt, his posture broadcasting authority and suspicion in equal measure. His partner, older and wearier, followed more slowly, his eyes already scanning the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had answered too many calls like this one. Andrea's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the confrontation unfold. Emily Rose had moved to Dylan's side, her white dress ghostly in the police lights, her face composed but alert. Dylan himself stepped forward to meet the officers, and something in his bearing made Andrea lean closer to her window. There was no fear in his posture, no defensive anger or resigned defeat. Instead, Dylan Johnson moved with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing. When he reached the first officer, he extended his hand in greeting. "Good evening, Officer Martinez," Dylan said, his voice carrying clearly across the street in the sudden quiet. "I'm Dylan Johnson. I believe someone called about our wedding reception." The young officer, Martinez, stopped short, his aggressive stride faltering as recognition flickered across his face. "Chief Johnson? Sir, we received a complaint about—" He trailed off, confusion replacing authority as he looked around the clearly legitimate celebration. "Chief?" Andrea's wine glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against her marble floor in an explosion of crystal and red wine that sounded like gunshots in the silence of her house. The word echoed in her mind, each repetition like a physical blow. Chief, police chief, the man whose wedding she had just tried to destroy, whose happiness she had attempted to criminalize, was the head of the very department she had called. Through her telescope, she watched the scene unfold with growing horror and fascination. The older officer, Sergeant Williams, according to his name tag, was openly grinning now, stepping forward to clap Dylan on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Chief," Williams said warmly. "Beautiful ceremony. My wife and I drove by earlier. She made me promise to tell Mrs. Johnson that her dress is the most gorgeous thing she's ever seen." Emily Rose stepped forward then, and Andrea saw Dylan's face transform. The professional composure melted away, replaced by something so tender and fierce that it made Andrea's chest ache with a longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades. Dylan took his wife's hand, threading their fingers together with the unconscious ease of two people who had already become one entity. "Officers, I'd like you to meet my wife, Dr. Emily Rose Johnson," Dylan said, and the pride in his voice was so pure, so uncomplicated, that Andrea felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Emily, this is Officer Martinez and Sergeant Williams from the precinct. Dr. Emily Rose Johnson. Not just beautiful, not just kind, but accomplished, intelligent, Someone who had built a life of meaning while Andrea had built walls of money and isolation. The complaint, Martinez said hesitantly, glancing around at the perfectly legal, perfectly contained celebration. Someone reported suspicious activity, but obviously, Dylan's expression shifted, hardening almost imperceptibly. His cop instincts were clearly kicking in, Andrea realized. He was starting to understand exactly what kind of call this had been. What specifically was reported? Dylan asked, his voice still professional, but with an edge that made Andrea step back from her window. Martinez consulted his notes. Trespassing, loud music, disturbing the peace. The caller said. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The caller said this was a quiet neighborhood with noise ordinances. The silence that followed was thick with implications. Andrea watched Dylan's jaw tighten as he processed the reality of what had happened. Someone had called the police on his wedding. Someone had looked at his celebration, his joy, his love, his family, and decided it didn't belong. Sergeant Williams cleared his throat. Chief, we'll file a report that the complaint was unfounded. Clearly, there's no violation here. Just a beautiful wedding in a private residence. But Dylan wasn't looking at the officers anymore. His eyes had found Andrea's house across the street, and even from this distance, even through her curtains, she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical force. He was a trained investigator, she realized with growing panic. He would figure out who had made the call. He would know it was her. Thank you, officers, Dylan said quietly. I appreciate you responding professionally to what was clearly. He paused, choosing his words carefully. A misunderstanding. As the police cars pulled away and the celebration slowly resumed, Andrea remained frozen at her window. Across the street, Dylan Johnson stood on his lawn, still looking directly at her house. Even from this distance, she could see the hurt in his posture, the way Emily Rose had moved to comfort him, the protective circle that his family had formed around their wounded joy. And in that moment, Andrea Duke realized that she had just declared war on the one person in Willowbrook who might have been capable of teaching her how to live again. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Sleep eluded Andrea that night like a ghost she couldn't catch. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Dylan Johnson's face in the police lights, the moment when professional composure cracked to reveal the raw hurt beneath. She had wounded something precious, something rare, and the weight of that knowledge sat on her chest like a stone. By dawn, she had consumed an entire pot of coffee and worn a path in her Persian rug with her pacing. The Johnson house across the street stood quiet now, decorated with the remnants of celebration. Fairy lights that looked forlorn in the morning sun. A few forgotten champagne glasses on the garden table. Rose petals scattered across the lawn like confetti from a dream. At 8:47 a.m., her doorbell rang. Andrea's heart lurched into her throat. Through the peephole, she saw Dylan Johnson standing on her front porch, still devastatingly handsome but now wearing the crisp uniform of the Willowbrook Police Department. His expression was unreadable, professional, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the careful control in his posture. Her hands shook as she opened the door, leaving the chain latch engaged so that only a sliver of space separated them. Mrs. Duke. His voice was carefully neutral, the voice of a police officer conducting official business. I'm Chief Dylan Johnson. I'd like to speak with you about a call that was made to our department last night. The morning air felt thick as honey in her lungs. I'm not sure what you mean. The call originated from this address. Dylan's dark eyes held hers steadily. Someone reported suspicious activity at my wedding reception. I'd like to understand what exactly seemed suspicious about a legal celebration on private property. There it was. The moment of truth she had been dreading since the police cars pulled away. Andrea could lie, could claim ignorance, could hide behind lawyers and wealth and the carefully constructed barriers that had protected her from consequences for decades. Instead, she found herself removing the chain latch and opening the door wider. It was me, she said quietly. I made the call. Something flickered across Dylan's face. Surprise, perhaps, that she had admitted it so readily. He had probably expected denials, deflection, the kind of privileged doublespeak that people like Andrea typically employed when cornered. "May I ask why?" The question hung between them like a blade. Andrea looked past him to the street where, just 12 hours ago, she had watched his world explode with joy while hers imploded with loneliness. How could she explain that his happiness had been a mirror that reflected her own emptiness back at her with unbearable clarity? She started, then stopped. The truth was too raw, too revealing. The noise was disturbing. Dylan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Duke, I've been a police officer for 15 years. I can tell when someone is lying to me." He paused, studying her face with the intensity of a man trained to read deception. "What really happened last night?" Before Andrea could answer, a car pulled into the Johnson driveway across the street. Emily Rose emerged from the passenger seat, radiant even in simple jeans and a sweater, her natural beauty undimmed by the harsh reality of mourning. She was carrying a casserole dish and laughing at something the driver, an elderly black woman who could only be Dylan's mother, had said. Andrea watched Dylan's entire demeanor change as his wife appeared. The professional mask slipped, replaced by something so tender it made her throat close with unexpected emotion. Emily Rose looked across the street, spotted her husband on Andrea's porch, and waved. Her smile was brilliant and uncomplicated, holding no trace of the hurt that must have shadowed the end of their wedding celebration. "She doesn't know, does she?" Andrea asked suddenly. "About the call." Dylan's attention snapped back to her. Emily Rose has enough real problems to worry about without adding neighborhood prejudice to the list. His voice carried a warning now, a protective edge that made it clear exactly how far he would go to shield his wife from pain. "Real problems. She's starting her residency at Children's Hospital next month. Pediatric surgery." Dylan's pride was evident despite his anger. "She's going to save children's lives, Mrs. Duke. She's going to make this world better in ways that actually matter." The implicit comparison hit Andrea like a physical blow. While Emily Rose dedicated her life to healing, Andrea had built her fortune on steel and isolation, contributing nothing to the world except tax-deductible charitable donations that bought her a cleaner conscience, but no real connection to the people she claimed to help. "I want to understand," Dylan continued, his voice dropping to something more personal, more dangerous. "What exactly did you see last night that made you think the police needed to be called? What about my family's joy struck you as criminal?" The question was a scalpel, cutting straight to the infected heart of her motivations. Andrea felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of his direct gaze. "You want the truth?" The words erupted from her before she could stop them. "The truth is that watching your wedding was like looking at everything I've never had and never will have. The truth is that your happiness was so—" She searched for the word, her voice breaking slightly. "So pure, so real. And it made me realize that I've been dead for 29 years and I didn't even know it." Dylan's expression shifted, confusion replacing anger. This was clearly not the response he had expected. "The truth," Andrea continued, the words flowing now like water through a broken dam, "is that I saw love in your backyard. Real love. The kind that transforms people, that makes them better than they were alone. And I called the police because I was jealous, because I was angry, because if I can't have that kind of joy, then maybe no one should." The silence that followed was deafening. Dylan stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a privileged neighbor making trouble, but as a wounded woman whose pain had metastasized into cruelty. "Mrs. Duke," he said finally, his voice gentler now but still cautious, "jealousy doesn't justify calling the police on black people for existing in your neighborhood. Loneliness doesn't excuse racism. I know." The admission came out as barely a whisper. "I know that, and I'm ashamed, and I don't know how to fix what I've done." Across the street, Emily Rose was helping Dylan's mother carry groceries into the house, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze like music. The sound made Andrea's chest ache with longing so sharp it felt like a physical wound. Dylan followed her gaze, and when he looked back at her, something in his expression had shifted again. The cop was still there, but now she could see the man beneath, Someone who understood pain, who had probably seen more than his share of people destroyed by their own choices. "The question is," he said quietly, "what are you going to do about it now?" The answer came 3 days later, in a manila envelope that arrived by courier with no return address. Andrea had spent those 3 days in a state of suspended animation, unable to eat, unable to work, unable to do anything but replay her conversation with Dylan over and over in her mind. What are you going to do about it now? The question haunted her waking hours and followed her into restless dreams. She had written 17 different letters of apology, each one ending up crumpled in her wastebasket. How did you apologize for racism? How did you say sorry for calling the police on someone's wedding? How did you explain that your hatred was really self-hatred, that your cruelty was born from a loneliness so profound it had calcified into something monstrous? The envelope changed everything. Inside were copies of police reports, newspaper clippings, and court documents that made Andrea's blood turn to ice water in her veins. The headline of the first newspaper article, dated 26 years ago, stopped her heart. Exeter Academy Scholarship student dies in car accident. Keisha Williams smiled up at her from a grainy black and white photograph. 18 years old and full of promise that would never be fulfilled. But it was the second document that made Andrea sink into her leather chair with a gasp that echoed through her empty house. A police report filed by Officer D. Johnson, dated 3 years after Keisha's death. A report about a hit-and-run accident involving a young woman working late shifts to support her family. A report that contained details only someone intimately familiar with the case would know. Dylan Johnson had been the responding officer to Keisha Williams' death. With trembling fingers, Andrea turned to the next document, a letter of commendation for Officer Johnson's dedication to victim advocacy, his work with families of traffic fatalities, his commitment to ensuring that every case received the thorough investigation it deserved regardless of the victim's race or economic status. The final document was a photocopy of Keisha's death certificate, with a handwritten note in the margin. Every life matters. Every story deserves to be told. Every injustice demands an answer. D.J. Andrea's hands shook as she reached for her phone, dialing the number on Dylan's business card with fingers that could barely hold steady. He answered on the second ring. "Chief Johnson. You knew." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "You knew about Keisha Williams." A long pause. "Mrs. Duke, I think we should meet." 20 minutes later, Dylan Johnson sat in Andrea's living room, looking incongruous among her museum-quality furniture and carefully curated art collection. He had declined her offer of coffee, declined her nervous attempts at hospitality, and now sat studying her with the same intensity he had shown on her doorstep 3 days ago. "How?" Andrea asked. "How did you know?" "I've been a cop for 15 years, Mrs. Duke. I know how to research." Dylan's voice was calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the careful control in his posture. "When someone calls the police on my wedding, I like to understand who I'm dealing with. But Keisha, the connection, wasn't hard to find once I started looking." Dylan leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Exeter Academy keeps excellent records. Your name was in the file as her roommate. And once I had that," he shrugged, "the rest of the pieces fell into place." Andrea felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "You think I'm responsible for her death? Are you?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Andrea closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 17 again, standing in the headmaster's office with a letter in her trembling hands. A letter that could have saved Keisha's future, could have prevented the chain of events that led to that rainy night, that fatal accident, that senseless waste of brilliant potential. "I had evidence," she whispered. "Evidence that would have proven she didn't cheat on that exam. But producing it would have implicated my friends, would have made me an outcast, would have—" She opened her eyes to find Dylan watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "I chose my own comfort over her life. I chose safety over justice. I chose silence over truth. And you've been carrying that guilt ever since." It wasn't a question. Dylan's voice held no judgment, no condemnation, just the weary understanding of someone who had seen too much human weakness to be surprised by any of it. Every day, Andrea admitted. Every success, every dollar I've earned, every charitable donation I've made. It's all been blood money. Payment for a debt I can never repay. Dylan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the wedding photos scattered on her coffee table. Photos she didn't remember placing there, images of Dylan and Emily Rose that she must have printed from social media in her desperate attempt to understand what she had tried to destroy. Keisha had a younger brother, Dylan said finally. Marcus Williams. He's a teacher now, works at an inner-city school in Detroit. Never married, never had kids of his own. But he's dedicated his life to making sure other kids get the chances his sister never had. Andrea's breath caught. You've been in touch with him? I reach out to families sometimes. Follow up on cases that stick with me. Dylan's expression softened slightly. Marcus talks about Keisha every time we speak. How smart she was, how determined. How she was going to change the world. The words hit Andrea like physical blows. She had stolen the world's chance to be changed by Keisha Williams. She had robbed Marcus of his sister, robbed countless children of the doctor who might have saved their lives, robbed the universe itself of the good that Keisha could have done. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Dylan was quiet for so long that Andrea began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than she deserved. Because Emily Rose spent her residency interviews talking about a doctor who inspired her to go into pediatric surgery. A doctor who died young, who never got the chance to save the children she dreamed of helping. He met Andrea's eyes directly. Dr. Keisha Williams was Emily's role model, the reason she chose her specialty. The revelation hit Andrea like a tsunami. Emily Rose, beautiful, brilliant Emily Rose, was carrying on Keisha's dream. Was becoming the doctor that Keisha had never had the chance to be. Emily Rose doesn't know about my connection to Keisha, Dylan continued. But when she starts saving children's lives next month, she'll be doing it in honor of a woman whose death your silence helped cause. Have you ever considered how our worst mistakes might somehow lead to unexpected redemption through others? What would it mean to discover that your greatest failure had inspired someone else's greatest purpose? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and pain. Andrea stared at the wedding photos, at Emily Rose's radiant smile, at Dylan's protective love, at the joy she had tried to destroy, and suddenly understood that this was bigger than her guilt, bigger than her loneliness, bigger than her carefully constructed walls of isolation. This was about completing a circle that had been broken 26 years ago. This was about finding a way to honor Keisha's memory through the very people Andrea had tried to hurt. This was about transformation. What do you want from me? She asked. Dylan's smile was small but genuine. I want you to help me do something that would have made Keisha Williams proud. The plan they conceived was beautiful in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Andrea would establish the Keisha Williams Foundation for Pediatric Medicine, endowing it with $50 million to provide scholarships for underrepresented students pursuing medical careers. Emily Rose would serve as the foundation's first recipient and spokesperson, receiving funding for her residency and future practice. The announcement would be made at a community gala, with Marcus Williams, Keisha's brother, flying in as the guest of honor. It should have been perfect. It should have been redemption wrapped in philanthropy, healing disguised as charity, love emerging from the ashes of hate. Instead, it became the catalyst for Andrea's complete destruction. The first blow came from her own board of directors. Absolutely not. Harrison Caldwell's voice echoed through the Duke Steel conference room with the finality of a judge pronouncing a death sentence. At 73, he was her father's oldest friend, her most trusted advisor, and apparently her most dangerous enemy. $50 million to establish a foundation for what exactly? Some girl who died in a car accident 30 years ago. Keisha Williams was a brilliant student who was black. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. And you want to publicly associate the Duke family name with racial justice causes? You want to make Duke Steel the poster child for diversity initiatives. Around the mahogany table, faces that had smiled at her for years now wore expressions of cold calculation. These were men and women who had known her since childhood, who had attended her father's funeral, who had pledged their loyalty to the Duke legacy. Now they were looking at her as if she had suggested burning the company to the ground. Thomas Duke built this empire on traditional values, said Margaret Winters, the silver-haired dragon who had controlled Duke Steel's public relations for 3 decades. Strength, stability, keeping politics out of business. What you're proposing would alienate our core customer base, our investors, our conscience. Andrea's voice was sharper than she intended. When did doing the right thing become bad for business? When the right thing started meaning apologizing for being successful, Harrison shot back. When it started meaning we should feel guilty for the advantages we were born with instead of grateful for the opportunities we created. The meeting deteriorated from there. Financial projections were thrown around like weapons. Threats of investor pullouts, customer boycotts, and board reorganization filled the air like poison gas. By the time Andrea left the conference room 2 hours later, she understood with crystalline clarity that pursuing the foundation would cost her everything she had spent her life building. But the real devastation was waiting for her at home. Emily Rose Johnson stood on Andrea's front porch at sunset, still beautiful but now brittle around the edges, her usual warmth replaced by something that looked suspiciously like pity. "Mrs. Duke, I think we need to talk." Andrea's stomach dropped as she invited Emily Rose inside, offering tea that was declined, small talk that fell flat, anything to delay the conversation she could see building in the younger woman's dark eyes. "Dylan told me about your offer," Emily Rose said without preamble. "About the foundation, the scholarship, all of it." And Emily Rose was quiet for a long moment, studying Andrea's face with the clinical assessment of someone trained to diagnose problems that couldn't be easily fixed. "I know about Keisha Williams," she said finally. "I've known about her since my sophomore year of college, when I first decided to specialize in pediatric surgery. She was my inspiration, my role model, the doctor I wanted to become." Emily Rose's voice was steady, but Andrea could see the pain beneath the surface. "What I didn't know until yesterday was that her roommate at Exeter, the girl who could have saved her, was my neighbor across the street. The accusation hung between them like a blade." Andrea felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her for the second time in a week. "Dylan also told me about your board meeting today," Emily Rose continued, "about how your own advisors are threatening to destroy your company if you go through with this foundation." "That doesn't matter." "It does matter." Emily Rose's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years learning to deliver difficult diagnoses. "It matters because you're trying to buy absolution, Mrs. Duke. You're trying to use money to fix a problem that money can't solve." The words hit Andrea like physical blows. "That's not. I want to honor her memory. I want to. You want to feel better about yourself." Emily Rose's composure cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath. "You want to write a check big enough to erase 26 years of guilt. But Keisha Williams doesn't need your foundation, Mrs. Duke. She needed your courage 26 years ago, and you chose not to give it to her." Andrea felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "I know that. I know I failed her. But I hoped that maybe I could." "Could what? Resurrect her? Change the past?" Emily Rose shook her head sadly. "Mrs. Duke, I don't need your money to honor Keisha's memory. I do that every day just by being the doctor she never got the chance to become. And I don't need your guilt-driven philanthropy to validate my career." The rejection was devastating in its gentleness. Emily Rose wasn't angry. She was disappointed, which was somehow infinitely worse. "What about Dylan?" Andrea asked desperately. "He seemed to think." "Dylan is a good man who believes in second chances," Emily Rose said quietly. "But he also knows that real redemption can't be purchased. It has to be earned through genuine change, not grand gestures." As Emily Rose stood to leave, Andrea felt the last of her hope crumbling to dust. "So what am I supposed to do? How do I live with what I've done?" Emily Rose paused at the door, her hand on the knob, her expression softening slightly. "I don't know, Mrs. Duke, but I know it's not by trying to turn your guilt into our salvation." The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid falling shut. That night, Andrea stood in her empty house surrounded by the ruins of her latest attempt at redemption. The foundation documents lay scattered across her desk like the remnants of a shattered dream. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members, lawyers, and financial advisors, all of them wanting to confirm that she had abandoned her ridiculous philanthropic delusion. Through her window, she could see the Johnson house across the street, warm light spilling from every window as Dylan and Emily Rose began their new life together. They were cooking dinner, she realized. She could see their silhouettes moving around the kitchen, working in the synchronized harmony of two people who had found their perfect match. They had love. They had purpose. They had each other. And Andrea Duke, billionaire philanthropist, had nothing but money and the growing certainty that she was exactly what Emily Rose had called her. A woman trying to buy absolution for a debt that could never be repaid. For the first time in 26 years, Andrea allowed herself to cry. Not the careful, controlled tears of calculated grief, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone who had finally understood the true depth of her own emptiness. The darkest hour had arrived, and she was drowning in it alone. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Andrea's world had collapsed for the third time in her adult life. She had spent those weeks in a kind of suspended animation, moving through her empty house like a ghost haunting her own life. Duke Steel continued to operate under the management of her board. Her daily routines continued with mechanical precision, and her bank account continued to grow with the relentless efficiency of compound interest. But Andrea herself had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. The envelope was hand-addressed in careful script, with a Detroit postmark and no return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper and a photograph that made Andrea's breath catch in her throat. The photo showed Keisha Williams at 18, radiant in her graduation cap and gown, standing between a proud mother and a grinning younger brother who couldn't have been more than 14. But it was the letter that shattered what remained of Andrea's carefully constructed defenses. Dear Mrs. Duke, Chief Johnson reached out to me last month and told me about your connection to my sister Keisha. He also told me about your idea for a foundation in her name. I wanted to write to you myself before you heard my response through other people. First, I want to thank you for remembering Keisha after all these years. It means more than you can know that someone from her time at Exeter still thinks about the impact she could have made. But I also want to tell you something that might surprise you. I don't blame you for what happened to my sister. Andrea's hands trembled as she read those words. The absolution she had been seeking, the forgiveness she had been trying to buy, was being offered freely by the one person who had the right to withhold it. I've spent 26 years thinking about that night, about the choices that led to Keisha working double shifts, about the rain and the visibility and the drunk driver who destroyed our family. And here's what I've learned. Blame is a luxury that the living can't afford when there are children who need teaching. Keisha always said that the best way to honor someone's memory is to live the life they would have wanted you to live. She would have wanted you to find peace, Mrs. Duke. She would have wanted you to stop carrying guilt that serves no one and start using your gifts to make the world better. I'm writing to tell you that there's a classroom of 37 kids in Detroit who need supplies, field trips, and hope more than they need a foundation with Keisha's name on it. There's a community garden that could feed families for the cost of one fancy gala. There are teenagers who need jobs and mentorship and someone to believe in them when no one else will. If you really want to honor my sister's memory, don't build a monument to your guilt. Build a life she would have been proud to know about. The work is small. It's daily. It's invisible to most people. But it's real in a way that foundations and press releases and tax write-offs never are. If you're interested in learning how to do this kind of work, I'll be in town next weekend visiting Chief Johnson and his wife. I'd be honored to meet Keisha's old roommate and show you what real redemption looks like. Yours in service, Marcus Williams. P.S. The kids at my school are studying genetics right now. If you happen to know anything about metallurgy or chemistry that might help them understand how elements bond together, they'd love to hear from someone who builds things for a living. Andrea read the letter 17 times before its meaning fully penetrated the walls of self-pity she had built around her heart. Marcus Williams wasn't offering her forgiveness. He was offering her purpose, not absolution through grand gestures, but redemption through small, daily acts of service that no one would ever applaud or commemorate. She looked up from the letter to find Dylan Johnson standing on her porch, his expression cautious but not unkind. This time, she opened the door immediately. "Marcus said he wrote to you," Dylan said without preamble. "He did." Andrea held up the letter, her voice hoarse from disuse. "He wants to meet. Do you want to meet him?" The question hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn. For 3 weeks, Andrea had wallowed in the luxury of her own despair, savoring the bitter satisfaction of being beyond redemption. Now Marcus Williams was offering her something infinitely more dangerous: the possibility of actually becoming a better person. "I'm terrified," she admitted. Dylan's expression softened. "Good. Terror means you understand what's at stake. What if I fail? What if I try to help and just make things worse? What if? What if you succeed?" Dylan interrupted gently. "What if you discover that the woman who pressed wildflowers between dictionary pages is still in there somewhere, waiting for a chance to do good?" The reference to her childhood hobby hit Andrea like an arrow to the heart. "How did you know about that?" "Emily Rose noticed the flowers in some of your old books when she was here. Pressed daisies, violets, baby's breath." Dylan's smile was small but genuine. She said it reminded her of Keisha, who used to collect leaves and flowers and turn them into art projects for the kids in her neighborhood. The connection between past and present, between the girl Andrea had been and the woman Keisha had become, felt like a gift she didn't deserve but desperately needed. "Marcus is coming here on Saturday," Dylan continued. "Emily Rose and I are having a small dinner, nothing fancy, just the 3 of us and some neighbors. You're welcome to join us if you'd like." "Your wife doesn't want me there." "My wife is a doctor, Mrs. Duke. She's seen people recover from things that should have killed them. She believes in the possibility of healing, even when the patient doesn't." Andrea looked across the street at the Johnson house, where warm light spilled from the windows and the sound of laughter drifted on the evening breeze. It wasn't the perfect, magazine-worthy celebration she had interrupted with her 911 call. It was something better. It was real life, messy and beautiful and full of second chances for people brave enough to take them. "What would I need to do?" she asked quietly. "Show up," Dylan said simply. "Listen. Learn. Stop trying to save the world and start trying to save yourself." For the first time in weeks, Andrea felt something stirring in her chest that might have been hope. It was fragile and terrifying and completely different from the grand redemption she had imagined. But it was real in a way that foundations and press releases could never be. "Saturday," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What time?" Dylan's smile could have powered the entire neighborhood. 6 o'clock. "And Mrs. Duke? Bring some of those pressed flowers. Marcus would love to see them." As he walked back across the street, Andrea clutched Marcus Williams' letter to her chest and allowed herself to imagine, for the first time in 26 years, that maybe, just maybe, she could become someone worth forgiving. Saturday arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything seem possible and terrifying in equal measure. Andrea stood before her bedroom mirror at 5:47 p.m., holding a small wooden box that hadn't been opened in 29 years. Inside, pressed between sheets of tissue paper, were the wildflowers of her youth: daisies from the field behind her childhood home, violets from her grandmother's garden, baby's breath from her first school dance corsage. The girl who had collected these treasures had believed in magic, in second chances, in the possibility that broken things could be made beautiful again. That girl had died the night Andrea chose silence over courage at Exeter Academy. But maybe, just maybe, she could be resurrected. The walk across Maple Street felt like crossing a continent. Each step carried the weight of 26 years of guilt, regret, and carefully constructed isolation. But it also carried something new: the fragile, terrifying possibility of redemption. Dylan opened the door before she could knock, his smile warm and encouraging. "Mrs. Duke, I'm so glad you came." The Johnson house was everything Andrea's wasn't: lived in, comfortable, full of the beautiful mess that accumulated when people actually used their space for living instead of displaying. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, books spilled from overflowing shelves, and the kitchen smelled like home-cooked food and love. Emily Rose emerged from the kitchen, stunning in a simple sundress, her natural beauty undimmed by the casual setting. "Andrea," she said, and the use of her first name felt like an unexpected gift. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me." Andrea's voice was barely a whisper. "I wasn't sure you'd want me here after everything." "Dylan told me about Marcus's letter," Emily Rose said gently. "About what you're trying to do. Real change, genuine change, is always worth supporting." Before Andrea could respond, a voice from the living room called out, "Is that her? Is that Keisha's roommate?" Marcus Williams rose from the couch like a force of nature, tall, broad-shouldered, with Keisha's warm eyes and infectious smile. At 40, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his purpose and refused to be swayed from it. "Mrs. Duke," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus Williams. Thank you for coming." The moment their hands touched, Andrea felt something shift inside her chest. This was Keisha's little brother, the boy who had lost his sister because of Andrea's cowardice. He should have hated her, should have blamed her, should have demanded justice or revenge or at least acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. Instead, he was looking at her with the same kind expression that Keisha had worn 29 years ago when she tutored Andrea through advanced calculus without asking for anything in return. "I brought something," Andrea said, her voice shaking as she held out the wooden box. "Pressed flowers. Dylan said you might want to see them." Marcus opened the box with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. His eyes widened as he examined the delicate specimens, each one a small miracle preserved in time. "Keisha would have loved these," he said softly. "She always said that flowers were nature's way of showing us that beautiful things could grow from dirt and darkness." He looked up at Andrea, his expression gentle but direct. She would have loved that her roommate collected them too. The simple words broke something loose in Andrea's chest. Tears she had been holding back for decades began to flow freely, 26 years of grief and guilt and regret pouring out in ugly, healing sobs. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry. I could have saved her. I had the letter, I had the proof, and I was too much of a coward to—" "Stop!" Marcus's voice was firm but not unkind. He moved to sit beside her on the couch, his presence solid and comforting. "Stop carrying that weight. Keisha wouldn't want you to spend your life drowning in guilt. But I failed her. I failed her when she needed me most." "Yes," Marcus said simply. "You did. You were 17 and scared, and you made a choice that hurt someone you cared about. But that choice doesn't define the rest of your life unless you let it." Andrea looked up at him through her tears, seeing Keisha's compassion reflected in his face. "How can you forgive me? How can you not hate me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to a framed photo on the side table. Keisha in her cap and gown, radiant with hope and possibility. "Because Keisha taught me that hatred is just love with nowhere to go," he said finally. "Because every day I spend hating you is a day I'm not spending helping the kids who need what Keisha would have given them. Because forgiveness isn't about you, Mrs. Duke. It's about freeing myself to do the work that matters." Dylan and Emily Rose had remained quietly in the background, but now Emily Rose stepped forward, her medical training evident in the way she assessed Andrea's emotional state. "Marcus has been telling us about his school," she said gently. "About the kids who need mentors, the programs that need funding, the small ways that people can make a real difference. It's not glamorous work," Marcus added. "There are no galas, no press releases, no tax write-offs. It's showing up every day to teach kids that they matter, that their dreams are possible, that there are adults in the world who believe in them." Andrea wiped her eyes, feeling something new stirring in her chest. Not the grand, sweeping emotion of her failed foundation plans, but something smaller and more sustainable. Purpose, direction, the possibility of useful work. "What would I need to do?" she asked. Marcus smiled. Keisha's smile, warm and inclusive and full of possibility. "Start small. Visit the school. Meet the kids. See what they need and how you can help provide it. Not as the billionaire philanthropist Andrea Duke, but as someone who wants to make amends by making a difference." The board will never approve. Then don't ask them, Dylan interjected. Do it as yourself, not as Duke Steele. Use your personal money, your personal time, your personal commitment. But I don't know how to work with children. I don't know how to. Neither did I when I started, Marcus said gently. But I learned. And you will too, if you're willing to put in the work. Emily Rose moved to sit on Andrea's other side, her presence warm and grounding. Marcus has agreed to let me volunteer at his school during my residency. We could learn together if you'd like. The offer hung in the air like a bridge between Andrea's old life and the possibility of something new. Emily Rose, brilliant, beautiful Emily Rose, who had every right to reject Andrea's attempts at redemption, was offering partnership instead of punishment. You would do that? After everything I've done? Because of everything you've done, Emily Rose corrected gently. Because transformation is possible. Because people can change. Because the best way to honor Keisha's memory is to help other kids achieve the dreams she never got to pursue. As the evening deepened and conversation flowed around the dinner table, Andrea felt something happening that she hadn't experienced in decades. She was becoming part of something larger than herself. Not through grand gestures or expensive displays of charity, but through simple human connection, shared purpose, and the radical act of showing up for people who needed her. When Marcus pulled out photos of his students, 37 kids ranging from 6 to 16, all of them hungry for knowledge and hope and adults who believed in their potential, Andrea saw not charity cases or tax deductions, but individuals with names and dreams and the same basic need for love and support that she had been denying herself for 26 years. There's one more thing, Marcus said as the evening wound down. Keisha kept a journal during her time at Exeter. I brought it with me, thinking you might want to read it. He handed Andrea a leather-bound notebook, worn soft with age and handling. She wrote about you, about how kind you were, how much your friendship meant to her, how grateful she was to have someone who understood what it felt like to be far from home. Andrea's hands trembled as she accepted the journal. Inside would be Keisha's words, her thoughts, her dreams, and probably her confusion and pain during those final weeks when everything fell apart. I can't, she whispered. I can't read about how I hurt her. Then read about how you helped her, Marcus said gently. Read about the late-night study sessions, the shared snacks, the way you made her feel less alone in a place where she was one of only a dozen black students. As Andrea clutched the journal to her chest, she realized that this was the real climax. Not some dramatic confrontation or grand revelation, but this quiet moment of human connection, forgiveness offered freely, and the possibility of becoming someone worth forgiving. The work ahead would be hard. There would be setbacks, failures, moments when she questioned whether she was doing enough or doing it right. But for the first time in 26 years, Andrea Duke had something more valuable than money. She had purpose, community, and hope. The girl who had pressed wildflowers between dictionary pages wasn't dead after all. She had just been waiting for someone brave enough to bring her back to life. 6 months later, Andrea Duke stood in front of a classroom of 37 eager faces, her hands covered in clay dust and her designer clothes long since replaced by practical jeans and a t-shirt that read "Science is magic that works." Okay, everyone, she called out over the excited chatter. Who can tell me what happens when we heat iron to 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit? A dozen hands shot up, voices calling out answers with the kind of enthusiasm that had once terrified Andrea, but now filled her with a joy she hadn't known was possible. These children, Destiny, who wanted to build bridges, Carlos, who dreamed of designing rockets, Amara, who planned to create new medicines, had become the center of her universe in ways that board meetings and profit margins had never managed. Miss Andrea, 8-year-old Jamal waved his hand frantically from the front row. Can we make the volcano explode again? Can we make it bigger this time? Added Sophia, her eyes bright with scientific curiosity that reminded Andrea painfully and wonderfully of someone she had known long ago. Through the classroom window, Andrea could see the school garden where Marcus was working with a group of older students, teaching them about soil chemistry and plant biology with the same patient dedication he had shown when tutoring her through the basics of classroom management 6 months ago. The garden had been her first real contribution, Not a grand gesture or a monument to her guilt, but a simple plot of land where children could watch seeds become food, where science became real and tangible and nourishing. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, days when she felt completely out of her depth, times when the children's trust felt too precious and fragile for someone with her history to deserve. But Marcus had been patient, Emily Rose had been encouraging, and Dylan had been there to remind her that redemption was a daily choice, not a destination. The board of Duke Steel had been less understanding. Harrison Caldwell's resignation letter still sat framed on her desk at home, not out of spite, but as a reminder that some bridges were worth burning. Half the board had followed him, along with 3 major investors and a handful of clients who couldn't stomach doing business with a woman who spent her Tuesday afternoons teaching underprivileged children about metallurgy. The financial hit had been significant but not devastating. Duke Steel was smaller now, more focused, operating with a mission statement that included social responsibility alongside profit margins. Andrea had discovered that running a company with conscience was more challenging but infinitely more rewarding than the soulless empire her father had built. "Miss Andrea, you're smiling again," observed Destiny, the 12-year-old who had appointed herself Andrea's unofficial therapy monitor. "That's good. You smile a lot more now than when you first came here." It was true. The woman who had once rationed her smiles like precious resources now found herself grinning at least a dozen times a day, when Carlos successfully explained molecular bonding to a younger student, when Amara showed her the notes she'd taken during their last chemistry experiment, when the children argued enthusiastically about which element would win in a hypothetical battle between carbon and silicon. After class, Andrea walked across the hall to where Emily Rose was conducting her weekly medical workshop. 6 months into her residency, Emily Rose had somehow found time to volunteer at Marcus's school every Tuesday, teaching children about anatomy, nutrition, and basic health care with the same passion she brought to her work at Children's Hospital. "How did the volcano experiment go?" Emily Rose asked, looking up from a diagram of the human heart that had captivated a group of 10-year-olds. "Messy, loud, and perfect," Andrea replied. "I think we may have a future engineer in Jamal. He wants to know if we can make a volcano big enough to launch a rocket." "Sounds like a job for next semester's physics unit," Emily Rose laughed. "Marcus has been talking about expanding the science program. I think he's been waiting for the right moment to ask if you'd be interested in developing a more formal curriculum." The suggestion made Andrea's heart race with excitement. A formal curriculum meant long-term commitment, real responsibility, the chance to build something lasting that would benefit children for years to come. It was everything she had tried to achieve with the Keisha Williams Foundation, but better, real instead of symbolic, humble instead of grandiose, focused on daily impact rather than public recognition. As they walked toward the parking lot together, Andrea marveled at how naturally their friendship had developed. Emily Rose had every right to maintain professional distance, to treat Andrea with polite wariness given their history. Instead, she had chosen to become a mentor, a collaborator, and something Andrea had never expected: a genuine friend. "Dylan and I are having a barbecue this weekend," Emily Rose said as they reached their cars. "Nothing fancy, just neighbors and friends. Would you like to come?" The invitation was casual, but Andrea understood its significance. 6 months ago, she had been the neighbor who called the police on their wedding. Now she was someone they wanted to spend their weekend with, someone worthy of their time and trust. "I'd love to," Andrea said. "Can I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Emily Rose smiled. "And maybe some of those pressed flowers you showed Marcus. Dylan's been talking about starting a nature photography hobby, and I think he'd love to see how you preserve specimens." As Andrea drove home through the streets of Willowbrook, she reflected on how completely her world had transformed. The physical landscape was the same colonial houses, the same tree-lined streets, the same pristine lawns and careful landscaping. But everything else had changed in ways that money could never have purchased. Her house, once a mausoleum of isolation, now buzzed with life. Children's artwork covered her refrigerator. Science equipment cluttered her garage, which had been converted into a workshop where she developed experiments for Marcus's school. Her calendar was full not with board meetings and charity galas, but with parent-teacher conferences, field trips, and the kind of small, meaningful commitments that created community. At home, she found Marcus sitting on her front porch, grading papers in the late afternoon sun. This had become their routine. He would stop by after school to discuss curriculum ideas, student progress, and the thousand small details that went into educating children who deserved every opportunity in the world. "How was the volcano experiment?" he asked, looking up from a stack of essays about photosynthesis. "Explosive," Andrea grinned, settling into the chair beside him. "I think we're ready for the bigger projects you've been planning." Marcus set down his papers and studied her face with the same careful assessment she remembered from their first meeting. "You know, when I wrote that letter 6 months ago, I wasn't sure you'd actually follow through. A lot of people talk about wanting to make a difference, but very few are willing to do the daily work it requires." "I almost didn't," Andrea admitted. "There were moments when I wanted to run back to my old life, when this felt too hard, too real, too much like actually caring about other people." "Exactly." Andrea laughed at the accuracy of his observation. "But then Destiny would ask me a question about chemical reactions, or Carlos would show me his drawings of the bridges he wants to build, and I'd remember that this isn't about me anymore. It's about them." "That's when you know the transformation is real," Marcus said gently. "When it stops being about your guilt and starts being about their potential." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Across the street, Dylan's police car pulled into the driveway, and Andrea felt a warm sense of belonging as he waved in their direction. This was her community now, not just the exclusive enclave of Willowbrook, but the broader network of people committed to making the world a little better, one small action at a time. As the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Andrea of the flowers she had pressed as a child, she pulled out her phone and scrolled to the contact she had added just that morning. Keisha Williams High School, Principal Martinez. The school in Detroit that bore Keisha's name had reached out through Marcus, asking if Andrea might be interested in consulting on their new STEM program. It would mean traveling, expanding her work beyond Marcus's classroom, taking on responsibilities that would stretch her growing skills in ways that both excited and terrified her. "Marcus," she said, her finger hovering over the call button, "do you think I'm ready for something bigger?" He looked at her with Keisha's warm eyes, full of encouragement and gentle challenge. "I think you're ready for whatever comes next, as long as you remember that it's not about the size of the impact. It's about the authenticity of the commitment. What kind of legacy do you think we create through small, daily acts of service versus grand, public gestures? Have you ever found that your greatest growth came through helping others achieve their dreams?" As Andrea dialed the number, she thought about the girl who had pressed wildflowers between dictionary pages, who had believed in magic and second chances and the possibility that broken things could be made beautiful again. That girl hadn't died at Exeter Academy 29 years ago. She had just been waiting for the right moment to bloom again. The call connected, and Principal Martinez's warm voice filled the evening air with possibilities. New students to inspire, new programs to develop, new ways to honor Keisha's memory through the radical act of believing in young people's potential. Andrea Duke, billionaire philanthropist, was gone. In her place sat a woman whose wealth was measured not in dollars but in the trust of children, the friendship of good people, and the knowledge that every day offered another chance to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, service over self. The real story was just beginning, and for the first time in 29 years, Andrea couldn't wait to see how it would unfold.